Charles Davenport had everything: money, power, and respect. The magnate was known for controlling every detail of his life, from billion-dollar deals to the way each servant breathed inside his mansion. Nothing escaped his vigilance, and everyone knew that defying his authority came at a heavy cost. Yet life, with its cruel irony, has a way of testing even the most powerful when they least expect it. And it was on an ordinary morning that Charles's mask of control began to crack. When he opened the door to his room, returning home earlier than expected, he was confronted with a scene he would never forget. Isabel Turner, the young maid in her simple uniform, was breastfeeding his son, Matthew, with trembling hands and frightened eyes. The world Charles had built on pride and rigidity collapsed in silence. The silence was broken only by the sharp sound of the door slamming against the wall as Charles entered. Isabel's heart raced, and Matthew, sensing the tension, let out a muffled cry against her chest. The millionaire's eyes, so accustomed to reflecting coldness and control, now burned with unrestrained fury. His heavy breathing betrayed the effort he was making not to explode immediately. The old clock on the wall marked each second like a merciless hammer, while even the motionless curtains seemed to bear witness to the confrontation. Isabel trembled, clutching the baby tightly, and for a moment it felt as if there wasn't enough air in the room to sustain the two worlds that had just collided: poverty and absolute wealth. Charles advanced like a predator cornering its prey. His firm steps echoed across the marble floor, heightening the young maid's despair. She tried to explain, but her voice failed, strangled by the fear of losing everything. Cold sweat dripped down her forehead, gluing strands of hair to her pale face. Her trembling fingers adjusted Matthew in her arms, not only to protect him, but to find in that gesture the strength she lacked. Charles raised his finger toward her, demanding an answer that never came. Her silence seemed even more provocative, as if hiding something beyond what her eyes revealed. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice rang out deep and sharp, like the strike of a blade. The tone of indignation reverberated off the bedroom walls, striking Isabel in full force. Tears began to gather in her eyes, but she didn't dare let go of him. She only pressed Matthew tighter against her chest, as if the baby were her only defense against the storm. Charles, unable to comprehend the scene before him, felt his pride being torn apart. To him, this was audacity in its highest degree, an unforgivable affront. And yet, there was something in the young woman's tearful eyes that disarmed him without his consent. A silent plea, loaded with secrets he did not yet know. Charles's muffled shout echoed through the mansion, and within moments 2 guards appeared at the door, bewildered by the scene. The master of the house, always rigid, now shook with rage, pointing at Isabel as if she had committed the most unforgivable of crimes. Matthew cried louder, frightened by the tension, and the maid's eyes pleaded for compassion, though her lips could not form a single word. For the guards, accustomed to carrying out cold orders, seeing their employer lose his composure like this was almost surreal. But Charles didn't care about judgment. He wanted answers, he wanted punishment, he wanted to regain the control that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. With each passing second, his anger grew, as if the mere sight of that scene were a poison corroding his pride. He was no longer just a man betrayed by an incomprehensible image, but a king threatened before his silent court. "She abused my trust," he shouted, raising his voice so that it reverberated through the luxurious walls. Isabel, curled up, wept in silence, holding Matthew as if her life depended on it. The weight of his words fell on her shoulders like stones, each accusation crushing her even further. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell the truth she kept inside, but fear was stronger, and her throat felt locked by an impossible knot. Her eyes begged, but her mouth remained sealed, as if each word were chained by an invisible force. Despair burned on her skin, and with each tear that fell, the humiliation became more unbearable. In that moment, Isabel was no longer just a maid before her master. She was a woman judged without the right to defend herself. The commotion attracted onlookers. Servants and guests, drawn by the noise, peered into the corridor, and within seconds the scene became a public spectacle. Charles, blinded by pride, raised his voice even more, as if he wanted to expose Isabel before everyone. With each word, her humiliation grew, but no one noticed that behind his fury lurked a hidden fear. A suspicion that the young woman carried a truth that could shake not only his authority, but also his heart. The whispers spread like wildfire, and disapproving looks were already appearing among the guests. Some even wondered whether this powerful and feared man had gone too far. But Charles ignored it all. In his mind, there was only room for rage, though deep inside, a faint voice was beginning to question whether he truly knew the whole story. Isabel could no longer hold back her tears. Her entire body trembled, and each sob seemed to echo louder in the heavy silence that consumed the mansion. Charles looked down at her like a relentless judge before a defenseless defendant, unaware that this scene hid a truth that would change everything. His hardened eyes demanded an explanation, but all he received in return was the muffled crying of the young woman, mingled with Matthew's sobs. Inside, she fought against herself. To speak the truth meant exposing herself to a risk she might not be ready to face, but silence condemned her even more. The world seemed to collapse on her fragile shoulders, and Isabel knew she could not run from that revelation forever. It was then that one of the oldest housekeepers, who had been watching the scene with a racing heart, stepped forward. Her eyes carried the weight of years of guarded secrets, and her voice, though soft, cut through the air like lightning. "Mr. Davenport, perhaps you should hear what she has to say before judging her." The simple phrase made the entire corridor hold its breath. Charles frowned, irritated, but something stirred inside him. He was so used to imposing his version of events that hearing a challenge felt like an intolerable affront. Yet the tension in the room was so overwhelming that, for the first time, he hesitated. The silence that followed was more deafening than the shouts of seconds before. Isabel slowly lifted her face, revealing tear-filled eyes that seemed to beg for mercy. With a trembling voice, she tried to find courage in her words. "I never meant to disrespect you," she whispered, her breath uneven. "I only did this because Matthew needed me, and there was no one else around." The incomplete confession sparked like a match in dry powder. Everyone leaned in to hear the rest, but she stopped mid-sentence, as if afraid of revealing too much. Charles stared at her in silence, trying to decipher every gesture, every tear. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to hear a truth that would shatter not only his trust, but the entire story he believed about himself and his family. Isabel's heart felt like it was about to explode inside her chest. Every gaze fixed on her was like a weight pushing her further into an invisible abyss. Matthew, restless, whimpered in her arms as if he could sense the young woman's despair. Charles, motionless before her, held the cold gaze of a man demanding answers, but deep down he hid a storm of doubts. Isabel's words still echoed in the air. "I only did this because Matthew needed me," and left everyone suspended, as if time itself had stopped. The silence, thick with tension, seemed to stretch on for hours. Finally, she took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and decided to reveal what she had kept secret for so long. "Matthew is not just your son, Mr. Davenport," she said with a trembling voice, yet firm enough for all to hear. The words fell upon the hall like a thunderclap. Whispers began immediately. Eyes met in shock, and some even doubted what they had heard. Charles, however, did not move. His eyes widened, but his body remained rigid, as if frozen in place. The blood seemed to drain from his face, and for a few seconds he simply did not know how to react. It was as though reality itself had been ripped out from under him. Isabel, now too weak to hold back the flow of tears, continued, "When Mrs. Davenport was still alive, she asked me for help. She couldn't breastfeed, she was too weak. I was the only option at that moment. I did it in secret because she didn't want anyone to know. Not even you." With every word, her voice broke, but the weight of the truth became impossible to contain. The impact was devastating. The powerful Charles Davenport, accustomed to having answers for everything, now found himself facing a secret that rewrote his family's history. The fury that had once consumed his chest began to mix with something new and unsettling: doubt. Isabel's words echoed in Charles's mind like relentless hammer blows. He, who had always believed himself in absolute control of everything around him, now faced a revelation that dismantled his authority in seconds. The name of his late wife, spoken by that simple young woman, brought back painful memories he had fought to keep buried. His pounding heart made his chest rise and fall violently, while his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could not accept that a secret of such magnitude had been kept from him, and worse, that it had come to light at that moment, before so many curious eyes. "Lies!" he roared, his voice reverberating against the walls like thunder. The guests recoiled instinctively, startled by his explosion of fury. "How dare you stain my wife's name?" he continued, his eyes blazing with hatred. His imposing figure seemed even larger, like a storm about to swallow everything in its path. For him, the pain of loss was still an open wound, and hearing that secret from Isabel's lips was like salt poured onto a scar that had never healed. His pride, more than wounded, was in flames. He could not bear the thought that someone in such a humble position had held onto something that placed him at a disadvantage. Isabel, shrinking before his fury, shook her head in desperation. "It's not a lie, Mr. Davenport. I swear on my life," she pleaded, her hands trembling as she held Matthew against her chest. The baby's cries filled the room, heightening the sense of chaos. But behind the young woman's tears was a quiet firmness, like someone who knew that the truth, however cruel, had to come out. The onlookers exchanged incredulous glances, some whispering that perhaps there was sense in what she said. Charles, however, did not want to listen. His pride would not allow it. To him, admitting it would mean accepting that he was not as powerful as he had always believed himself to be. Isabel drew in a deep breath, trying to gather courage as tears still streaked her face. The weight of every eye on her was suffocating, but there was no turning back now. With each word she had hidden for years, her heart raced as if it wanted to leap from her chest. "I'm not making this up," she began, her voice shaky but firm. "Mrs. Davenport called me one night, in secret. She was weak, frail, and said she couldn't feed Matthew. She asked for my help, and begged me never to tell you." The entire corridor fell silent, and even the baby's cries seemed to soften, as though fate itself was waiting for the next detail of her confession. Some guests held their breath, others covered their mouths in shock, and the scene became a silent theater where every gesture carried the weight of a verdict. Charles felt the ground slip beneath his feet. His wife's name, Elizabeth, sounded like an open wound every time it was spoken. He remembered well the nights he found her pale, forcing a smile to hide the pain. But he had never suspected the depth of that fragility. "You're saying," he murmured, his voice heavy, almost trembling, so unlike the implacable authority everyone knew. "That my wife trusted you more than me?" The question fell like a bitter accusation, but inside him was something even more painful. The realization that Elizabeth may have carried a burden alone that he, in his arrogance, had failed to notice. His chest burned with contradiction, and for the first time in years, the wall of pride that upheld his image began to crack. Around him, the silence of the guests was so intense that every breath seemed to echo like thunder. Isabel nodded, even though she knew it might seal her ruin. "She only wanted to protect you. She didn't want you to see her as weak or incapable of taking care of herself. I accepted because I couldn't refuse. I saw the desperation in her eyes, and I saw Matthew's cries. There was no other choice." Her voice trembled, but each word carried the raw truth of someone who had nothing to gain from exposing that secret. The guests, stunned, exchanged looks laden with emotion. Some discreetly wiped away tears, moved by the young woman's courage. Charles, however, was torn between pain, anger, and a crushing doubt. Had he failed the woman he claimed to love above all else? The weight of that question fell upon him like an avalanche, and for the first time, his hardened eyes revealed something no one expected to see: vulnerability. Charles remained motionless, but inside he was at war with himself. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with a single glance now seemed a stranger before them all. The pride he had clung to for decades made him want to shout, to throw Isabel out, to end the humiliating spectacle. But something stronger held him in place. The memories of his wife, Elizabeth's weary eyes in her final months of life, and the cruel doubt that perhaps he had ignored obvious signs because he was too busy preserving his image as an unshakable man. His jaw tightened in silence, while the guests, stunned, watched the slow unraveling of the giant who once seemed untouchable. It was like watching a king stripped of his crown before his own people. Charles's prolonged silence was interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as a sign that he was about to explode even more violently, while others began to see the vulnerability of a man who, for the first time, seemed incapable of controlling his own narrative. Isabel, still kneeling with Matthew in her arms, kept her gaze lowered, but felt the tension grow like a rope about to snap. Her breathing was short, irregular, yet there was something in her posture no one could ignore. The courage of someone daring to face the storm in the name of truth. The contrast between the two was shocking, the powerful master of the mansion crumbling before the quiet strength of a simple maid. Charles closed his eyes for a few moments, trying to regain control of the situation. When he opened them, he no longer saw just submissive faces, but eyes heavy with judgment. The elite gathered in his mansion no longer applauded him in silence as they always had. There was disapproval, indignation, and even compassion directed at Isabel. It was like a dagger to his pride, realizing that, for a moment, he was no longer the center of respect and authority, but rather a man exposed, flawed, and questioned. The wall he had built over years was beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes, and each fragment that fell left him more human than he had ever wanted to be. Isabel took a deep breath, as if she needed to dive into her own past to find the right words. Her tear-filled eyes reflected pain, but also courage. "I remember that night as if it were yesterday," she began, and the mansion's silence grew even heavier. "Mrs. Elizabeth called me discreetly into her room. She was pale, exhausted, and could barely hold Matthew in her arms. She said she felt too weak, that her body no longer responded as before. And then, with tears in her eyes, she begged me to help her. I tried to refuse, but how could I deny the plea of a desperate mother?" With every word, Isabel seemed to relive the moment, and the guests, hypnotized, felt themselves transported to that memory hidden by time. Charles felt his stomach churn. Every detail retold by Isabel was like a dagger, because deep down he remembered similar signs. Yet in those days he had chosen to cling to work, to business trips, to million-dollar contracts he considered indispensable. Perhaps he had preferred the illusion that Elizabeth was strong enough to endure everything on her own, because admitting otherwise would mean facing his own vulnerability. He closed his eyes for a moment, and images of his wife smiling despite the pain came flooding back. Regret began to burn inside him like fire, yet doubt still consumed him. Was Isabel manipulating the memory of the woman he had loved most? Isabel quickly wiped her tears, but her voice did not falter. I promised her I wouldn't tell anyone, not even you. She said she needed you to keep believing you had everything under control, that you were the foundation of the family. Elizabeth didn't want her weakness to become a burden to the man she loved most. And that's why I took on that role in secret. Her confession fell like a sentence on Charles's heart. The weight of the truth was suffocating. The millionaire, so used to dictating rules and destinies, now found himself a prisoner of memories that made him question whether he had ever truly known the woman with whom he had shared his life. Charles held his head in his hands, as if trying to stifle the whirlwind of thoughts consuming him. His breathing grew heavy, almost gasping, and the hard stare he had always used to intimidate now shattered before everyone's eyes. The man who once seemed unshakable was in ruins. No, it can't be true, he murmured, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Every word from Isabel sounded like an echo from the past, memories he had tried to forget, but which now returned with devastating force. The pride that had sustained his entire life seemed to crumble, and for the first time, Charles appeared small beneath the weight of the truth. His shoulders, once held high with arrogance, now slumped like those of a defeated man, and even his voice carried the fragility of someone battling an invisible enemy, regret. The guests exchanged looks heavy with astonishment. Some, once intimidated by the magnate's presence, now saw only a lost father, stripped of his armor of power. Discreet murmurs filled the hall, hushed comments that made the air vibrate like an electric current. Charles, however, barely noticed. He paced back and forth, unable to remain steady, as if the ground itself had lost stability beneath his feet. His heart raced, and his hands trembled visibly. He could no longer maintain the mask he had cultivated for so long. He was exposed, vulnerable, stripped of any facade. It was as if the elite who once feared him were now witnessing the fall of a stone idol, revealed to be nothing more than a common man of flesh, bone, and mistakes. With each disoriented step, his silence screamed louder than any word. I failed her, he confessed, almost in a whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. The phrase fell like a sentence upon the room. Isabel, still holding Matthew to her chest, felt her soul tighten at the sight of the man before her falling apart. For a moment, there was no longer master and maid, but only a man consumed by regret and a woman carrying the weight of a secret. Charles placed a hand on his chest, as if trying to control the pain that was now more emotional than physical. For the first time, tears welled up in his eyes, revealing that the merciless Charles Davenport was collapsing before them all. The hall, once the stage of his authority, now bore witness to his surrender to pain, and no one could look away from the moment that would forever change the magnate's image. Matthew's cries, which until then had been only a painful backdrop to the scene, suddenly changed in tone. It was a strange, irregular sound, as if air could no longer reach his lungs. Isabel's eyes widened and, in panic, she realized something was wrong. No, no, please, she murmured, rocking the baby gently in her arms. The color of his tiny face was beginning to change, shifting from rosy to a troubling shade. The hall, which moments earlier had been focused on Charles's collapse, plunged into a terrifying silence. Time seemed to stop, and every heartbeat thundered in the ears of those present. Isabel's breath came in short, broken gasps, her entire body trembling at the unthinkable possibility of losing the child there, before everyone's eyes. The guests immediately erupted into chaos. Some screamed, others covered their mouths, unable to react to the desperation. Charles, upon hearing his son's strangled sounds, snapped out of his trance of grief. "Matthew!" he cried, his voice breaking with fear, and rushed to Isabel. The man who minutes earlier had been consumed by fury was now only a father in despair. His tear-filled eyes could not comprehend how, in so little time, fate seemed determined to rip away everything he loved most. The baby writhed, his cries growing weaker, and the sense of helplessness dominated the atmosphere. The magnate, so used to solving problems with money and power, now discovered that none of his wealth could buy a single breath more for his son. Despite the panic, Isabel searched for strength in her courage. "He's not breathing properly," she cried desperately, looking around for help. Some guests tried to step forward, but no one knew what to do. Chaos took over, voices overlapping in despair, and the entire hall turned into a whirlwind of fear. Charles held his head in his hands, kneeling beside Isabel, silently begging God that it wasn't already too late. The millionaire, once proud and untouchable, was now just a father desperate in the face of life's fragility. Isabel looked at Matthew, realizing that her decision in that moment would define everything. She knew she had to act quickly, even if it meant facing once again the cruel judgment of everyone around her. Isabel's heart pounded, but within her, an unexpected courage began to rise. She knew there was no time to waste. Every second of hesitation could cost Matthew's life. With tears in her eyes and trembling hands, she laid the baby carefully across her arms, holding him firmly. The entire hall held its breath, not daring to interrupt. Some guests whispered among themselves, others wept openly, unable to hide their fear. It was as if the child's fate was suspended in the air, and everyone waited for this simple woman to accomplish the impossible. Isabel, who had so often been invisible in that mansion, was now the only hope under the astonished gaze of the elite. Charles, kneeling beside her, watched with his heart in pieces. Helplessness consumed him. His mind screamed to intervene, but his muscles refused to obey. For the first time in his life, he could not command, buy, or order anything. He could only watch. His eyes followed Isabel's every move, his breath faltering at each gesture. The magnate who had once been arrogant now seemed nothing more than a broken father, dependent on the courage of the maid he had so often despised. His pride, which had so often placed him above others, now had no value at all. The silence between each motion was torturous, and Charles felt that every second stretched into an eternity. Isabel held Matthew firmly against her, taking a deep breath before acting. "Hold on, little one. Please hold on," she murmured, as if her voice alone could bring him back to life. Then she performed the infant Heimlich maneuver with surprising delicacy and precision, pressing the baby's chest in an attempt to clear his airways. The hall erupted in gasps, and a few guests instinctively moved closer, but stepped back when they realized they were witnessing something far greater than they could control. Time seemed frozen, and every eye was fixed on Isabel. Each of her movements was accompanied by silent prayers, as if fate itself had placed in this humble woman's hands the mission to decide between life and death. Even the guards, always rigid and impassive, leaned forward, unable to look away from the scene. For an instant that seemed eternal, nothing happened. The entire hall was immersed in deadly silence, every gaze fixed on Isabel's small gestures. Then, suddenly, a fragile sound broke through the air. A short cough, followed by a strong cry. Matthew was breathing again. Relief spread through the room like a wave, drawing gasps, tears, and even spontaneous applause. Isabel clutched the baby to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as her shoulders shook with emotion. She had done it. Against all odds, she had saved the child's life before everyone's eyes. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst, but alongside the fear came the overwhelming sense of a miracle realized. Charles buried his face in his hands, unable to hold back his tears. His heart, once consumed by anger and pride, now overflowed with gratitude and regret. He reached out his arms for his son, but hesitated when his eyes met Isabel's. There was something in that moment that paralyzed him. The image of this humble woman, crying and trembling, yet radiating an unshakable strength he had never imagined existed. The magnate, so used to seeing Isabel as nothing more than a shadow in the mansion, now saw her as the woman who had returned life to what he loved most. With every beat of his heart, he felt his pride crumble into pieces, replaced by a quiet reverence. For the first time, he asked himself, who truly was this woman he had so long underestimated? The guests, still overcome with emotion, began to rise to their feet, transforming the hall into a scene of collective commotion. Some people wept openly, others whispered words of respect and admiration. Isabel, embarrassed, tried to shrink under the storm of gazes, but there was no hiding what everyone knew. She was the heroine of the night. Charles, meanwhile, collapsed to his knees beside her, embracing Matthew with a gentleness he rarely showed. His tears mingled with hers, and for the first time, there were no barriers between master and servant. They were simply two human beings united by the miracle of life. The sound of applause echoed like a chorus of justice, forever marking that moment in the memory of all who witnessed it. The hall still vibrated with applause when a new wave of murmurs began to spread. Among the guests, someone whispered who this woman truly was, the one who had shown such courage and knowledge to save a life in seconds. Charles, still kneeling beside her, asked himself the same question. He now looked at Isabel with different eyes, as if truly seeing her for the first time. There was not only humility in her gestures, there was technique, there was experience. Could not be the work of chance. Something in her past had to explain the confidence with which she acted, even in the midst of collective panic. Isabel took a deep breath to steady her sobs and realized there was no longer any reason to hide. The weight of the secret she had carried for so long now demanded release. "I am not just a maid," she said, her voice low but steady. The entire hall fell silent, and even the guards' footsteps seemed to stop. "Before I lost everything, I was a nurse. I worked for years in hospitals, saving lives, caring for children like Matthew. But after a personal tragedy, my world collapsed. I lost my family, I lost my home, and this job was all that remained." Her confession struck everyone like lightning, transforming collective perception in an instant. Charles felt his chest tighten at the revelation. The weight of each of Isabel's words resonated within him as an undeniable truth. He, who had so often judged her by the position she occupied, was now forced to confront the greatness hidden behind that simple maid's uniform. The guests whispered among themselves, some with tears in their eyes, others shaking their heads in admiration. Isabel, however, did not speak with pride, but with the pain of someone who had had to rebuild her dignity in the silence of an invisible routine. The contrast was overwhelming. The woman once humiliated now stood as an unlikely heroine, and no one in that room would ever see her the same way again. The silence that followed Isabel's revelation seemed heavier than any applause. Charles rose slowly, still holding Matthew in his arms, and faced the woman before him. His eyes were red, not only from tears but from the weight of everything he had just heard. The elite who watched him waited anxiously for his reaction, as if each word he spoke would dictate the final verdict of that night. Charles took a deep breath, his chest heaving, and for the first time his voice carried no tone of command or arrogance. It was the voice of a man stripped bare in his vulnerability. Each second of silence felt like an eternity, and everyone there knew something irreversible was about to be said. "Isabel Turner," he said slowly, as if each syllable weighed a ton. I judged you without knowing your truth. I humiliated you, treated you as if you were nothing. But today you showed me that you are so much more than I ever imagined. You didn't just save my son. You saved me as well." The confession fell like a shockwave across the room. Some guests placed their hands over their hearts, moved. Others applauded immediately, unable to contain their emotion. Charles, however, did not stop there. His voice trembled, but his words carried a sincerity never before seen in him. With each sentence, it was as though part of his pride fell away, and in its place emerged a different man. More human, more truthful, more aware of his own smallness before the greatness of the maid he had despised. He turned toward the entire hall, raising Matthew in his arms as living proof of the miracle. "You are all witnesses. This woman, whom so many ignored just as I did, is the true heroine of this night." His words echoed through the room, breaking any barrier between master and servant. Isabel, embarrassed, lowered her head, but was met with a standing ovation. The sound filled every corner of the mansion, transforming humiliation into triumph. Some guests approached to congratulate her, while others simply cried in silence, acknowledging the strength of such a revelation. Charles, once feared for his power, now surrendered to the greatness of humility. For the first time, the truth was not a source of shame but of honor. In that moment, everyone knew they were witnessing history, one of those moments that never fades from memory. The hall took a long time to quiet down. Every applause, every tear, and every gaze cast toward Isabel seemed to echo as testimony to the greatness that had emerged that night. Charles, still standing before them all, held Matthew with a tenderness rarely seen, while casting glances filled with gratitude at the young woman who had changed his life forever. Isabel, shy, tried to retreat, but she could no longer return to the shadows of invisibility. Everyone now knew who she was. The woman who had found the courage to face prejudice, pain, and even death itself, only to save a life. The aura of respect surrounding her was so powerful that even the most skeptical bowed before the truth. Charles drew in a deep breath and let his voice rise one final time. "Tonight has taught me something I will never forget. The value of a person is not in their position, their wealth, or their title. It lies in their courage, their character, and their humanity." His declaration sounded like both a confession and a public apology. The entire hall remained in respectful silence, absorbing his words. Some guests, deeply touched, discreetly wiped away tears. Others nodded in agreement, recognizing that even the most powerful can learn life's harshest lessons. Those words were not meant for Isabel alone. They were meant for everyone. A reminder that arrogance is fragile, but humility is eternal. Isabel lowered her eyes, moved, and whispered almost to herself, "I only did what any mother would do." But the phrase, simple and humble, pierced the hall like an arrow. Charles, overcome with emotion, stepped closer and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture unthinkable only hours before. "No, Isabel, you did what few would have had the courage to do." The silence stretched for a moment, and then the applause began again, louder than before, a collective recognition. That night, Isabel ceased to be just the maid of the Davenport mansion. She became a living symbol of strength, humility, and unconditional love. And for all who witnessed it, one unforgettable lesson remained. Never judge someone by the position they occupy, because true greatness often hides in the most unlikely places. The echo of that night would remain as a milestone, reminding everyone that, in the end, what defines a human being is the capacity to love and to sacrifice for others. If the story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any more moving stories, and of course, leave your like. It helps the channel keep bringing you powerful, life-changing stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.